In December 1941, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a far-off border. It had turned into the front line. After Pearl Harbor, the threat didn't just come from the sky or the big Japanese battle fleet. It was hiding under the waves. Japanese submarines prowled the shipping lanes of the Pacific, lurking in silence and out of sight. Their goal was to cut off America's lifeline, scare people where they least expected it, and remind a scared nation that the conflict may come to their shores. The I-class submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy were some of the best in hunting under the sea at the time. They were intended for offensive operations far from Japan's home waters. They could transport reconnaissance planes, were heavily armed, and could travel long distances. During the first several months of the war, boats like the I-19 and I-25 snuck into the huge Pacific Ocean to look for tankers, transports, and warships that held America's chances for recovery. The ships they attacked were more than just steel and cargo. They were the lifeblood of a country trying to recover after Pearl Harbor. The shock came right away. Torpedoes trailed merchant ships that were once thought to be secure near American shores. People quickly established convoys, but the system was still weak and uncoordinated in those first several weeks. The Pacific Ocean, which is thousands of miles wide, left numerous ships open to attack. When torpedoes hit freighters that weren't being guarded, their blazing wrecks were a dismal sign of a new reality. The seas around America was no longer safe. For the Japanese, these early victories were important both in terms of military strategy and in terms of morale. Not only were submarine commanders told to sink ships, but they were also told to spread fear. That mission even included the United States itself. The I-17 submarine came up off the coast of California in February 1942 and fired shells at the Elwood oil field near Santa Barbara. The harm to property was small, but the psychological effect was huge. The attack represented the first foreign shelling of the U.S. mainland since the War of 1812. Weeks later, the I-25 carried the fight even beyond. After shadowing maritime lines along the Pacific Northwest, it surfaced to shell Fort Stevens in Oregon. Once again, the bodily repercussions were negligible, but the symbolic was unsettling. Ordinary Americans, already scared by blackouts and air raid drills, suddenly recognized that the ocean no longer provided safety. Japanese submariners had demonstrated they could reach over thousands of miles to touch American territory. The most notorious of these boats, I-19, proved exactly how destructive Japan's submarine fleet might be. In September 1942, it fired a spread of torpedoes that dealt devastating blows during the Battle of the Solomon Islands. The aircraft carrier USS Wasp was hit and sunk, while additional torpedoes damaged the battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien. That single volley became one of the most successful submarine attacks of the entire war. It proved the reach and lethality of Japan's submarine fleet, and it frightened American leaders into taking the threat more seriously. Yet, even as Japanese submarines gained their wins, the roots of their eventual collapse were already there. Unlike the German U-boats in the Atlantic, which coordinated in wolf packs and hit in concentrated campaigns, Japanese strategy distributed its submarines. They targeted warships instead of focusing on merchant convoys, losing the potential to restrict Allied supply lines. Still, in those early months, the terror they generated was real and widespread. Coastal villages along the Pacific erected watchtowers. Civil defense units drilled for invasions that never arrived. Reports of submarines offshore, some actual, some imagined, spread like wildfire. The United States was suddenly conscious of its vulnerability. Each sighting, each shell that fell on American coastlines, underscored the disturbing truth. The Pacific was no longer a barrier. It was a battleground. For American sailors, the lessons were hard. Destroyers and newly commissioned destroyer escorts would soon be hurried into service, boats specifically equipped to hunt submarines. But in the winter and spring of 1942, those ships were too few, their personnel too inexperienced, and their sonar technology still basic. Japanese submarines used this opportunity, going aggressively into American seas with considerable ease. The emotional toll was just as enormous as the cash losses. Families on the West Coast lived under the shadow of possible invasion. Blackout curtains became part of daily life. Rumors of Japanese landings arose after every sighting. Panic even reached Washington, as officials discussed how to soothe the frightened populace without discounting the very real threat offshore. What gave these strikes such weight was not their scale but their symbolism. America, freshly wounded by Pearl Harbor, now faced the disconcerting realization that its mainland was not impregnable. The Pacific, formerly regarded as a protecting moat, has been breached by submarines whose commanders hailed their capacity to bring war to America's doorstep. Yet even as these early punches struck, the tide was beginning to shift. The United States was mobilizing, building fleets of destroyer escorts, aircraft carriers, and long-range patrol aircraft. Convoys were being organized, and technology such as radar and improved sonar was coming into service. Japanese submarines would soon find the seas increasingly more unfriendly. But in the earliest months of the war, their presence was clear. They hunted freely, attacked boldly, and left behind a path of sunken ships and frightened shores. They had achieved what their superiors wanted most in that moment: to instill dread, to interrupt supply lines, and to convey a frightening message that the Pacific belonged to them. For America, it was a wake-up call. The silent hunters of Japan had forced the nation to recognize the true nature of the battle ahead. The Pacific was huge, and the enemy beneath the waves was determined. What came next would be a struggle of endurance, technology, and resolve. And as Japanese submarines resumed their patrols, the United States began constructing an answer that would come in the form of the destroyer Escorts, ships whose firepower and resilience would soon astound the very men who formerly prowled the oceans with impunity. From the opening menace of Japan's long-range submarines attacking America's Pacific lifeline, the threat only grew as the war entered its first full year. What had begun with solitary patrols now extended across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japanese I-class submarines, notably I-21 and I-26, prowled the waters from Hawaii to Australia to the remote Aleutians, turning commercial convoys into susceptible victims. The oceans that formerly delivered goods in relative safety now become killing grounds, and each passing month exposed just how fragile the lifelines of an island nation could be. By early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy switched its submarine campaign toward disruption of supply. Their targets were no longer merely warships, but the tankers and transports that delivered fuel, food, and ammunition. Without them, ships could not sail and armies could not fight. The Americans, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, quickly understood that their supply channels were under siege. Convoys blasting out of San Francisco or Los Angeles toward Australia were marked men. Ships packed with aircraft parts, vehicles, and troops pushed into the great Pacific expanse, only to be shadowed by unseen hunters. I-21, a fearsome submarine launched just before the war, swiftly established itself as one of the most feared predators. Operating off the California coast and then in Hawaii, it prowled for ships laden with oil, knowing that a single well-placed torpedo could start a floating inferno. Reports reported how vessels struck in these early months burned for days, their black smoke columns reaching high over the water. The spectacle was visible for miles, stark warnings to any convoy crew that survival was never guaranteed. For the Japanese crews looking through periscopes, the effect was both tactical and psychological. Each effective blow not only sunk tonnage but spread panic among sailors who could not see their attackers. Farther south, I-26 adds to the tally. Operating on the approaches to Australia, it stalked routes delivering reinforcements from the United States. Australia was a critical base for the Allies, and without consistent shipments, it would be impossible to project power back into the Western Pacific. The submarine's presence was a persistent menace, requiring escorts to stretch their scant resources across infinite distances. Convoys that once sailed with a sense of normalcy now prepared for abrupt explosions and urgent abandon ship orders. In the northern Pacific, other submarines expanded the campaign into the Aleutian Islands, harassing supply vessels transporting equipment to distant outposts. The chilly, secluded waters made the threat more worse. Crews who escaped a torpedoing feared perishing in icy seas before aid could come. The Japanese approach attempted to stretch the U.S. Navy's defense lines thin, attacking in numerous theaters simultaneously to overwhelm the nascent convoy system. The shock to the American command was immediate. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff faced the truth that their merchant fleet was not only inadequate but also dangerously exposed. Unlike Britain, which had undergone years of U-boat warfare in the Atlantic, the United States had little recent experience in assembling huge convoy formations. Merchant commanders were accustomed to independent sailings, not the rigorous discipline required for protection under escort. Each successful Japanese strike demanded speedy adaptation. The U.S. Navy began assigning destroyers and smaller escorts to merchant groups, though their numbers were still too few. Tankers became key assets, guarded as closely as capital ships. The losses emphasized that fuel was as decisive a weapon as firearms or bombs. Without oil moving safely over the Pacific, carriers could not sortie, and aircraft could not take flight. For sailors aboard the convoys, the experience was nerve-wracking. Days of peaceful steaming may be disrupted by a sudden explosion, the steel hull trembling as torpedoes tore through cargo holds. Survivors told how fire spread immediately across tanks, forcing sailors to rush into the sea. Some convoys lost numerous ships in a single patrol, leaving survivors clinging to rafts while escorts sought shadows with depth charges. The Japanese submariners, meantime, endured their own challenges. Extended patrols far from home drained both machinery and troops. I-class boats were big by submarine standards, but weeks at sea took their toll. Crews lived in confined quarters, enduring heat, diesel fumes, and the continual pressure of silent stalking. When a convoy was struck, the euphoria of victory was tempered by the danger of retaliation, as American escorts pressed harder with each strike. By mid-1942, the convoy conflicts exposed a sobering truth. The Pacific, vastly wider than the Atlantic, amplified both potential and danger. The Japanese submarines could operate over huge distances, yet the very expanse of the ocean also weakened their effectiveness. They scored triumphs, but they could not be everywhere. For the U.S. Navy, the issue came in selecting where to concentrate precious escorts. Hawaii, Australia, and Alaska each demanded protection, yet no single theater could be disregarded. Strategically, the campaign yielded mixed results. The Japanese inflicted terrible casualties, destroying tankers and scattering survivors. But unlike the German U-boat war, which nearly cut Britain's arteries, the Japanese submarine campaign never achieved the same magnitude. Decisions in Tokyo prioritized fleet confrontations above lengthy commerce raids. Submarines that would have blocked the Pacific supply lines were often diverted to reconnaissance or support of surface operations. This minimized the long-term impact, yet in 1942, the threat felt overpowering to those who suffered it. The psychological effect remained intense. American civilians on the West Coast received newspaper accounts of submarines shelling oil sites and sinking ships near to shore. In Australia, families anxiously anticipated convoys that often never arrived. The picture of flaming tankers became symbolic of a new reality. The war was no longer distant, and the Pacific's immensity was no shield. The U.S. Navy replied with urgency. Training for convoy organization accelerated. New escort ships were pushed into development, from destroyer escorts to converted merchantmen. Radar and sonar technology were upgraded to better submarine detection. The lessons learnt in these months formed the framework for the more formidable escort forces that would later sweep the seas. By the end of 1942, the tide had not yet changed, but the situation drove change. Convoys began to sail with greater discipline. Escorts grew more confidence in their depth charge patterns. Slowly, the hunters found themselves hunted in return. Yet, in those early months, the balance of dread still belonged to the Japanese. I-21 and I-26 revealed that even in the largest oceans, supply lines may be clogged, and fleets starved of gasoline. The war for the Pacific convoys was barely beginning, and the lessons of fire and smoke would resound over the coming years. The Americans were adapting, but the struggle was far from over. Ahead lay the test of how destroyer escorts, yet in their infancy, would rise to meet the deadly challenge beneath the seas. From the devastation caused by submarines across the Pacific maritime routes, the crisis now intensifies into America's desperate hunt for safety. Merchant ships burnt on the horizon, tankers sunk beneath the waters, and yet, through most of 1942, convoys often sailed alone. The Pacific was huge, but its dangers were immediate, and the nation's lifeline was seeping away. At first, many in the Navy hoped existing fleet destroyers could cover the issue. These ships were quick, highly armed, and proven in warfare. Yet they were far too few for the size of the maritime war already unfolding. Every carrier task force demanded them as screens against air and submarine attack. Battleships required their own escorting squadrons. Even amphibious operations attracted warships for close support. The maths were impossible. There were simply not enough hulls left to look over the endless line of merchantmen transporting supplies westward. The consequences were stark. Japanese submarines like the I-19, I-21, and I-26 cruised the commerce lanes, attacking whenever chance presented itself. Tankers laden with aviation fuel burst in torrents of flames. Cargo ships carrying weapons split apart in tremendous blasts. Survivors floated for days, clinging to wreckage, while the ocean bore quiet witness to their loss. By the middle of 1942, the rate of sinkings concerned even the most confident planners in Washington. Without escorts, the Pacific War effort was in risk of grinding to a standstill. The Navy's senior leadership received urgent dispatches from theater commanders. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor underlined the vulnerability of the supply lines supplying the island bases. In Australia, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur relied on convoys from the United States to sustain their buildup. Each report underlined the same truth. Losses of merchant shipping were weakening the underpinning of the entire Pacific campaign. For the seamen aboard commerce vessels, the threats were personal and persistent. A lookout scanning the horizon understood that a torpedo may emerge from the sea without warning. Gun crews manned their small deck armaments, but against coordinated submarine attacks, their odds of survival were limited. Even when a Navy destroyer happened to be close, its speed and depth charge racks were often more suited to fleet fights rather than convoy protection. To the men at sea, the absence of professional bodyguards was felt with every mile of open water. The strategic reaction demanded something new. The Navy needed smaller ships, built swiftly and in huge numbers, with the special mission of convoy protection. They had to be capable of prolonged patrol speeds matching the sluggish merchantmen, armed with sonar to locate submarines, and equipped with depth charges to pursue attacks. They did not need the massive guns of a fleet destroyer, nor the fuel-hungry turbines that limited America's supply. Instead, they required simplicity, reliability, and numbers. American shipyards, already strained under the pressures of producing carriers, cruisers, and landing craft, now faced another urgent order. Naval planners collaborated with the Maritime Commission and industrial leaders to develop warships that could be constructed fast utilizing existing facilities. Every day lost meant more ships sunk. Washington's haste was apparent in directives that prioritized these new escorts even among conflicting requests for steel, engines, and labor. By late 1942, the picture was bleak. Some historians later commented that the casualties experienced in the Pacific, though not necessarily as concentrated as in the Atlantic's Black May, threatened the same outcome: collapse of logistical support. A single sunken oiler might impair the endurance of an entire task force. Every merchantman sunk carrying ammunition or spare components delayed operations on Guadalcanal or hampered the defense of Hawaii. Within the Navy, officers pressed their case with increased ferocity. If convoys could not be shielded, victories ashore or at sea would be transitory. America's huge industrial output depended on secure shipping across the seas. This insight represented a turning point. Fleet destroyers alone could not suffice. The necessity for escort warships became a strategic imperative. The human stories validated the numbers. Survivors of sunken ships reported scorching nights when torpedoes struck and cargo holds erupted. Rescue often arrived only after countless hours adrift. Many sailors, both Navy and merchant, were lost in these attacks, their sacrifice highlighting the cost of delay. These tales reached back to Washington and provided weight to the chilly statistics emerging on charts. The Navy's solution, the destroyer escort, was not yet at sea in 1942. But the demand for it was being inscribed daily in smoke and flame. As the year finished, America was at a crossroads. Its carriers had blocked Japan at Coral Sea and Midway, But victory meant little if supply lines could not endure. Merchantmen could not continue to sail undefended. The pressure of this period cannot be understated. Logistics are generally unnoticed in combat, but in the Pacific they dictated whether bases could be held, whether airfields could be supplied, if fleets could remain at sea. America's arsenal might create ships and aircraft in unprecedented numbers, yet without safe passage, they remained dormant. This reality motivated the strong push for escort building. The tale of 1942 was therefore one of imbalance, powerful fleet forces at sea, but convoys vulnerable in their wake. The Japanese submarine arm, though smaller than Germany's, grasped the chance to inflict losses well out of proportion to its size. The United States understood the risk, but the response lagged behind the necessity. It was a race between shipyards and the ocean graveyards overflowing with wrecks. As the new year approached, momentum shifted. Plans were approved, contracts made, and construction accelerated. But before these specialist escorts could enter service, convoys would continue to sail at terrible risk. The men aboard those merchant ships bore the cost of time, as America fought to transform urgency into steel. The tale finishes with the shadow of incomplete ships lingering on the ways. The losses of 1942 had exposed the nation's weakness, and the desire for reform was absolute. The Navy would satisfy that demand, but in the meantime, the Pacific lifeline remained frighteningly thin. Ahead lay the arrival of those same vessels, purpose-built to guard convoys and combat submarines in their own realm. The destroyer escorts were coming, and with them, a new chapter in the defense of the Pacific. From America's acute shortage of convoy protection, the story now swings to a moment of transition. What had been a tale of weakness and vulnerability was about to become a narrative of perseverance, as the United States deployed a new weapon designed not for fleet battles but for the quiet, grinding struggle against submarines. The destroyer escort force had come, and with it, the promise of changing the tide at sea. In 1943, the first of these ships went into service. The Everts-class destroyer escorts, commanded by boats such as USS Everts, D5, represented a new concept in naval defense. They were smaller and lighter than fleet destroyers, yet they carried the same technologies that mattered most in the submarine war. Radar to sweep the horizon, sonar to pierce the depths, depth charge projectors poised to blast hiding adversaries into submission. These were not ships built for glory in huge surface engagements. They were ships meant to withstand, to guard, and to strike forcefully when submarines prowled too close. The Everts class was followed rapidly by the Buckley and Cannon classes, each refining the concept and boosting the fleet's capabilities. Their arrival was not sudden. It was the result of frenzied wartime planning, manufacturing, and the awareness that America's ocean lifelines could not survive without committed protectors. Shipyards from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf churned out these new vessels with remarkable speed, their slipways filled with steel destined for convoy defense. Each keel laid was not only a number in wartime manufacturing but a lifeline for commerce seamen risking the Pacific. The ship's design represented compromise and purpose. At roughly 1,200 to 1,400 tons, they lacked the powerful cannons of destroyers. But what they gave up in firepower they acquired in expertise. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars allowed them to discharge patterns of explosives front of their bows. This improvement meant escorts no longer had to pass directly over a contact before hitting, decreasing the possibility of losing the submarine in sonar blind spots. Combined with enhanced depth charges and creeping attack tactics, they provided escorts the capacity to hunt with a new ferocity. Crews were generally young, hastily trained, and put into service with only a few months' training. Yet the ships they manned became schools of fight, where practice quickly gave way to combat. Escorting merchantmen over the darkened seas, they learnt to trust their sonar operators' ears, their radar screens' faint echoes, and the painful lessons of surprise attacks. In the Black Pacific nights, where tankers had once burnt under submarine torpedoes, the destroyer escorts began to write a new story. The mere presence of these ships began to affect the battlefield. Japanese submarines, which had earlier considered convoys easy prey, now met tough guardians. Some stories stated that submarine captains grew more wary, recognizing that escorts were not sluggish merchantmen but hunters in their own right. Even when submarines fled, the days of effortless strikes were receding. Strategically, the escorts provided American commanders what they had lacked in 1942: flexibility. Fleet destroyers, formerly pulled away from key offensive operations to guard convoys, could now return to their core duty. The escorts took the duty of defense, freeing larger warships to support amphibious assaults and fleet actions. Every landing, from the Solomons to the Gilberts, was made more possible because supplies could proceed under escort. USS Everts herself symbolized the class's promise. Commissioned in April 1943, she took on convoy responsibilities that had previously strained the Navy's resources. While she would not become famous for dramatic sinkings, her continuous duty embodied the very essence of the destroyer escort mission: to shield, to watch, and to make possible the movement of troops and material. Behind each convoy that reached its destination stood ships like Everts, unsung but crucial. The Buckley class expanded on these foundations. Larger and faster than the Everts, they carried more powerful engines and greater weapons. USS Buckley, DE-51, namesake of the class, typified the move from desperation to confidence. The Cannon class, meanwhile, offered range and endurance, providing protection across large swaths of ocean. Together, these ships increased the reach of American sea power. By late 1943, convoys that had once been murdered in unprotected waters now sailed under the watchful eye of escorts bristling with anti-submarine gear. Losses did not end, but the balance was shifting. The Japanese drive to restrict American supply lines was weakening. Every torpedo that missed, every submarine driven down by depth charges, testified to the expanding strength of escort forces. The impact was more than tactical. For commercial sailors, who had earlier felt abandoned on the wide seas, the sight of a destroyer escort's silhouette across the horizon gave security. They realized that someone was watching, listening, and ready to battle on their behalf. Morale surged, and with it, the willingness to continue the risky excursions across the Pacific. The escorts also became a proving ground for new doctrines. Coordinated strikes, when many escorts boxed in a submarine, were refined. Radar-directed gunnery and nocturnal interceptions grew sharper. What had begun as a stopgap solution was becoming a professionalized art of anti-submarine warfare. In the words of one naval assessment, these ships gave America a shield for her arteries of war. The greater strategic implication was apparent. By safeguarding the supply lines, destroyer escorts permitted the United States to project power much deeper into the Pacific. Without them, the island-hopping battles of 1943 and beyond would have faced devastating shortages. With them, invasions could be conducted with assurance that reinforcements and supplies would not be cut off by lurking submarines. Yet the saga of these ships was far from ended. Their landing signified simply the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle beneath the seas. The Japanese submarine fleet, albeit increasingly pushed, did not just evaporate. It adapted, seeking new techniques, new hunting grounds, and times of opportunity. The destroyer escorts had set the stage for fights still to come, where talent, endurance, and unrelenting pursuit would determine the outcome. As 1943 closed, the Pacific no longer belonged completely to the hunter below. For the first time, the hunter had become the prey. The balance of the sea war was shifting, propelled ahead by warships long neglected but now crucial. And when these ships took their place on the front lines of convoy defense, the next part of the struggle was about to commence. Ahead lay the challenge of combat itself, where destroyer escorts would clash directly with submarines in duels of stealth, detection, and abrupt brutality. The arrival of America's destroyer escort squadron had indicated a dramatic transformation in the war at sea. Their arrival offered new confidence to the personnel guarding key convoys, but the true test was still to come. By late 1943, these ships will meet the deadly submarines of Japan in their first test under fire. What ensued was a revelation, not only for the Americans, but for the Japanese sailors who instantly recognized that the ocean battlefield had been altered. As the Pacific battle progressed, the Japanese Imperial Navy continued to rely largely on its submarine force. Their aim was straightforward: interrupt supply lines, isolate American forces, and delay the tide of reinforcements flowing westward. At the time, Japan's submarines, larger and longer-ranged than their German counterparts, were a genuine risk. Vessels like I-175 prowled the commerce lanes, looking for inadequately protected convoys. For months, they inflicted agonizing losses. But by late 1943, the balance began to shift. The destroyer Escorts, fresh from American shipyards, were ready to prove their worth in combat. The USS McCoy Reynolds, designated D-440, stood amid these new guardians. Though tiny compared to a full-size destroyer, she was far from underarmed. Her decks brimmed with anti-submarine weaponry, depth-charge racks, ahead-throwing projectors, and a sonar system capable of piercing the hush of the deep. Crewed by youthful sailors, many barely out of training, the ship reflected the industrial force and urgency of wartime America. She and her sister ships represented not simply vessels of steel, but symbols of a nation's willingness to defend its soldiers and supplies from the invisible peril below. In the waning months of 1943, one such menace manifested itself. The Japanese submarine I-175 had already acquired a reputation for bravery. Operating off the Pacific supply channels, she tried to cut into American lifelines and strike at the vulnerable underbelly of convoy operations. In November, reports of submarine activity reached Allied command, and destroyer escorts were sent into action. Among them was McCoy Reynolds, steaming with resolution into waters where the enemy prowled. The encounter began as so many anti-submarine efforts did, with uncertainty. A blip on sonar, weak but continuous, hinted to a lurking foe. Below the waves, the crew of I-175 navigated in stealth, unconscious that the balance of technology had changed against them. For years, submarines have been predators, slipping past escorts that lacked the capability to detect them consistently. Now, with sonar directing the hunters, the roles were reversing. McCoy Reynolds narrowed the distance. Orders rang out, and her team hurried to their positions. Depth charges were readied along the stern, their fuses set to detonate at calculated depths. Then, with a shiver through the deck, the first charges rolled into the sea. Seconds later, the peace of the Pacific was disturbed by the thunder of explosions. Water geysered into the air as shockwaves rocked the depths. Inside I-175, the Japanese crew felt the concussions rattle their hull. Reports from survivors of similar attacks later recounted the fear of depth charges. The lights flickering, gauges twitching, the metallic groan of steel fighting the ocean's crushing might. For them, the search had suddenly become a frantic struggle for survival. McCoy Reynolds circled back, her sonar team tracing the sounds. Another run, another pattern of charges. The ocean swirled wildly, a vortex of pressure and disaster. Sister escorts joined the attack, building a persistent barrier around the convoy. Each pass tightened the noose, denying I-175 the chance to escape away. What Japanese submariners once considered as manageable opposition has suddenly become a near-impossible gauntlet. The impact of this clash stretched beyond a single submarine. For the Japanese, it became evident that the age of effortless strikes was over. The destroyer escorts, mass-produced in American yards and mounted with cutting-edge detecting gear, constituted a systematic solution to the submarine menace. Convoys that once sailed in fear may now rely on guardians developed specifically for this function. The ocean, previously favorable to the hunter, was swiftly becoming a battlefield of parity, and soon of American dominance. For the crew of McCoy Reynolds, the action was a baptism of fire. Many of the sailors had never before faced a live submarine. Now they saw firsthand the effectiveness of their training, the accuracy of their sonar operators, and the destructive potency of their depth charge runs. Confidence spread among the men. What had begun as apprehensive expectation concluded in the conviction that their ship could meet the challenge. Strategically, the results were profound. Every submarine forced to dodge rather than attack meant convoys reaching safely. Supplies reached frontline Marines, aircraft fuel poured to forward bases, and the massive machinery of the Pacific operation ground forward. The Japanese, already struggling under resource difficulties, could ill afford to lose efficiency in their submarine arm. Each defeat, Each failure to intercept American convoys added to the rising pressure on Tokyo's war effort. In the months that followed, more engagements highlighted the pattern. Japanese submarines attempted to stalk convoys but were increasingly intercepted. Reports poured back from crews. The Americans now possessed a response, a specialized fleet of escorts that turned ambush into peril. Where formerly submarines had tormented Allied sailors, now it was the Japanese who felt the dread of being detected, tracked, and attacked with ruthless accuracy. The trial of late 1943 had proved pivotal. It revealed that America's investment in destroyer escorts was not theoretical. It was practical, deadly, and successful in the broad Pacific. The Japanese, noticing the shift, confronted the grim fact that their once proud submarine war was fading. For the Allies, it was a turning point, a moment when the tide of the undersea war began to flow in their favor. As the Pacific convoys raced westward, guarded by McCoy Reynolds and her sisters, the message was unmistakable. The Hunter was no longer safe in its shadows. The troops who had once dreaded the abrupt hit of a torpedo could now glance to the horizon and know that they were defended. And for the Japanese submarine personnel, the deep ocean, long their sanctuary, was now a site of rising danger. The first trials against Japan's submarines were more than isolated confrontations. They were a signal of what was to come. In the years ahead, the undersea struggle would escalate, but never again would the submarines of Japan enjoy the advantage they previously enjoyed. America's destroyer escorts had arrived, and with them the Pacific would never be the same. Ahead, another problem loomed. As convoys got larger and activities advanced farther into hostile waters, the role of these escorts would expand. Their next test would come not in isolated confrontations, but in the furnace of enormous fleet actions, where survival hinged on cooperation, endurance, and the will to confront the enemy head-on. The struggle against Japan's submarines in late 1943 had indicated a turning point. The Hunter had become the prey, and American destroyer escorts now cruised the seas with increased confidence. Yet what followed in the months ahead would go much beyond regular convoy defense. It would become one of the most amazing submarine hunts in naval history, an achievement so astonishing that even veteran officers struggled to accept it. In May 1944, the USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort, raced into the waters of the Solomon Islands. She carried the same instruments as her sisters: sonar, depth charges, and Hedgehog projectors. But what set her distinct was not her armament, but the relentless efficiency of her crew. Within 12 days, this single ship would transform the trajectory of the submarine war in the Pacific by sinking 6 Japanese submarines in succession. I-16, RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, RO-108, and RO-105. The story began with I-16. In mid-May, intelligence intercepts showed that Japanese submarines were seeking to resupply isolated garrisons around the Pacific. The Imperial Navy anticipated that by smuggling supplies through, it could keep stranded units alive and prolong the conflict. USS England, operating with a small task group, received orders to intercept. On May 19th, her sonar picked up a contact. The ship swung into action. Hedgehogs were fired, patterns spread ahead of the bow. Moments later, undersea detonations verified a direct strike. I-16 was destroyed. It was the beginning of a streak unrivaled in naval history. Barely 3 days later, the pattern repeated. RO-106, attempting to maneuver unobserved, was caught in England's net. The Escorts sonar operators, their training enhanced by regular rehearsals, tracked the submarine's evasive twists. The cruiser closed in, firing salvos of Hedgehog projectiles. Explosions thundered beneath the sea, and the submarine was lost with all men. 2 submarines in less than a week, already a tremendous performance for a single escort. But USS England was not finished. On May 23rd, she struck again, this time against RO-104. Once more, the group displayed immaculate cooperation. The sonar crew maintained contact, the ship altered course, and the Hedgehog mortars were fired. Witnesses later remembered the impression of waiting for the pattern to hit, seconds of silence, followed by the sudden eruption of detonations. The submarine split apart beneath the waters. 3 triumphs now stood to England's credit. By now, word of her successes was spreading through the fleet. To sink even one submarine was considered a tremendous accomplishment. To demolish 3 in 4 days was practically unheard of. Yet the pace did not slacken. On May 24th, the very following day, England struck again, this time claiming RO-116. The kill proved what many sailors had begun to believe, that this ship, created by America's wartime shipyards and commanded by determined sailors, was rewriting the story of anti-submarine combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy, startled by the losses, proceeded to press its submarines into action. On May 26, RO-108 fell prey to the same unrelenting pursuit. England, her men now seasoned by previous conflicts, conducted the attack with studied accuracy. Once again, sonar guided the way, and once again, the Hedgehog projectors completed their work. The submarine was destroyed, leaving the Americans with 5 wins in just over a week. The climax occurred on May 31st. RO-105, another submarine assigned to patrol the waters around the Solomons, was detected. England moved in, engaging with the same devastating sequence. The consequence was the same. The submarine was demolished, marking the 6th confirmed kill. In less than 2 weeks, USS England had sunk half a dozen enemy submarines, a total no other Allied warship would match during the entire war. For the Japanese submarine force, the blow was disastrous. Already crippled by losses in past conflicts, the Imperial Navy could not quickly replace these boats or their trained crews. Submarines that might have jeopardized convoys or backed isolated garrisons were gone. The Solomon Islands, long contentious waters, grew more secure for American operations. For the crew of USS England, the feat held both pride and grave thought. Each victory had been total. None of the enemy sailors survived. Reports praised the precision with which the sailors carried out their jobs, never allowing joy to overpower the gravity of the event. They recognized that every submarine sunk meant hundreds of Japanese sailors lost beneath the waves, and with them, the decreasing hope of a navy battling against unimaginable odds. Strategically, the campaign underlined the effectiveness of America's escort fleet. Mass-produced, adaptable, and outfitted with superior sensing gear, these ships proved capable not just of defending convoys but of carrying the fight directly to the enemy. England's victory was not only a tale of luck, it was the outcome of training, technology, and commitment applied with ruthless constancy. The sinking of 6 submarines also held a symbolic weight. It sent a strong message to the Imperial Japanese Navy. The oceans were no longer theirs to prowl freely. Each failure limited their ability to interdict American supply routes. Each loss chipped away at Japan's ability to wage a sustained naval battle. And each win gave American sailors newfound conviction in their ships, their tactics, and their united goal. As word of England's streak went around the Pacific, she became a legend among escort crews. Sailors praised her name with awe, and her record stood as a benchmark. For a navy engaged in a global fight, events like this provided both tangible security and a morale boost that reverberated far beyond the Solomon Islands. By the summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese submarine force was a shadow of what it had once been. The constant hunts by escorts like USS England ensured that American convoys reached their targets, supporting the drive throughout the Central Pacific. Supplies for landings, fuel for carriers, and reinforcements for island battles all flowed beneath the shield of escorts whose faith had been strengthened by achievements like this one. The USS England's momentous chase is inscribed in the annals of naval warfare. In 12 days, she did something few ships in history could claim, destroying 6 enemy submarines in consecutive action. For the troops who served aboard her, it was proof that discipline, coordination, and vigilance could vanquish even the most elusive of adversaries. For the Imperial Navy, it was yet another reminder that America's industrial and tactical strength was closing down upon them with growing inevitability. The memory of that streak would continue long after the conflict. Naval historians, reflecting on the conflict, have often pointed to England as the personification of what the destroyer escort program achieved. She was a ship meant for defense, yet she became a weapon of decisive offense. Her triumphs helped seal the destiny of Japan's submarine arm and underlined the realization that the Pacific, long vast and unpredictable, was being progressively brought under American control. As 1944 continued, the impetus acquired in these waterways would carry ahead. The ensuing conflicts would not be confined to the deep depths but would unfold across entire fleets, where escorts like England would fight alongside carriers and battleships in the final confrontations still to come. The loss of USS England and her sisters had sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy. 6 submarines lost in less than 2 weeks indicated that America's escorts had become an overwhelming force. Yet the story of this shift was not shared just by Allied crews. It also emerged through the rare voices of Japanese submariners who survived the ordeal, men whose recollections presented a terrifying image of what it meant to be trapped beneath the water while America's destroyer escorts closed in. These were sailors who had faith in the strength of their vessels. Submarines like the I-class and RO-class were previously considered powerful weapons of stealth and surprise. But by 1944, against the new generation of American escorts, those identical boats became steel graves. Captured survivors, interrogated after rescue or surrender, later recalled their shock at the severity of Allied strikes. They had entered the conflict expecting duels of patience and cunning, but instead found themselves battered by barrages that offered no escape. One remembers the sound of the search. It began with the quiet buzz of propellers overhead, then the harsh pings of sonar resonating through the hull. For the crew of a submarine, each pulse signaled discovery was nigh. In former years, evasive movements or deep dives might have been enough to shake a pursuer. By late 1943 and 1944, that was no longer true. The escorts stayed riveted on their quarry, their sonar perfected and their operators skilled in detecting every turn. Depth charges followed. Survivors told of the ship's unrelenting rhythm. Patterns rolled off the stern in spreading arcs, each explosion rattling bulkheads and pulling fittings from their positions. The concussion crushed ears, shattered light bulbs, and left men gasping in darkness filled with suffocating fumes. But terrible still was the Hedgehog. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at specified depths whether they contacted a submarine or not, Hedgehog projectiles detonated only on contact. That meant silence until a direct hit. And when it arrived, the violence was absolute. Captured officers revealed their amazement at how fast the Americans altered their methods. Escort personnel cooperated with planes and with one another, weaving screens that hemmed submarines in. Some survivors from boats like I-401, taken later in the war, remembered the shock of finding that even their most advanced designs could not withstand this new attack. They had banked on speed, endurance, and concealment. Instead, they found themselves pursued down by spacecraft created in dizzying numbers, each bristling with technology that left little opportunity for mistakes. For Japanese crews, the psychological toll was severe. Men lived in continuous fear of discovery, sleeping in brief, nervous lengths as escorts prowled overhead. Food resources diminished during longer hunts, while carbon dioxide piled up in the stagnant air. Reports portrayed sailors collapsing from tiredness and despair as their captains ordered desperate maneuvers to break away. Each failed attempt further intensified the awareness that they were stuck in an environment where every advantage now belonged to the enemy. American interrogators, compiling these accounts, noted recurring themes. The Japanese submariners were not unskilled. Many had trained rigorously and fought with determination. But they confronted an opponent whose industrial power promised an endless supply of escorts, each one equipped with radar, sonar, and advanced weapons. What one survivor dubbed the hammer from above was not the result of chance. It was the product of a system that could replace ships, train crews, and refine tactics at a pace the Imperial Navy could not hope to match. For the United States, these voices reinforced what sailors at sea already understood. By mid-1944, the balance had shifted irreversibly. No longer did convoys travel at the mercy of underwater wolf packs. Instead, the escorts governed the fight, driving submarines into the defensive and punishing any attempt to strike. The remarks of seized men offered human witness to what the sinking tallies had revealed. The submarine arm of Japan was being pounded into extinction. The contrast was stark. In 1942, American shipping had been ravaged, with merchantmen burning on the horizon. Submarines prowled close to coasts, sending oil tankers and freighters to the bottom. By 1944, the Escorts had reversed the equation. Convoys pushed steadily across the Pacific, their supplies feeding campaigns from New Guinea to the Marianas. Japanese submariners, once hunters, now counted the hours until their destruction. Yet even as they recalled the hopelessness, some survivors expressed respect for the crews that defeated them. They spoke of the discipline of the Americans, the precision of the attacks, and the relentlessness of the pursuit. In their statements lay an acceptance of the reality that technology alone was not decisive. It was the training, coordination, and willpower of those who handled it that swung the tide. Strategically, the repercussions were severe. The fall of Japan's submarine arm meant less threats to the lifelines that sustained Allied offensives. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements crossed the Pacific with greater assurance. Every island conquered, every airfield created, every strike launched against Japan's heartland depended on the convoys the Escorts safeguarded. The tales of captive submariners highlighted the futility of their mission, illustrating how the very weapon they once trusted had become a trap. The industrial imbalance was impossible to overlook. For every submarine Japan lost, America launched additional escorts, trained more men, and refined detection methods further. Survivors of I-401 and other boats knew that their nation could not maintain pace. They had been sent to sea in machines made with care but in numbers too tiny, and against an enemy whose production lines seemed infinite. Their testimony conveyed not only the fear of warfare but also the despair of soldiers who recognized they were waging a war their fleet could not win. The comments of these men, preserved in reports, provide a human face to the figures of loss. They remind us that beneath each sinking lay crews that fought and suffered in silence, facing the dread of depth charges and the crushing finality of explosions that destroyed their boats forever. Their words echo the evolution of the Pacific War, from a fight of uncertainty to one in which America's escorts ruled the seas. As the conflict pressed into late 1944 and beyond, those escorts would continue their march. Ahead lay the climactic conflicts of fleets on the move, carriers, battleships, and cruisers storming across the Pacific. But even in those big engagements, the simple destroyer escorts carried forward the lessons acquired from submarine hunts, ensuring that the supply lines remained intact and the tide of war kept flowing toward Japan. The grim reports of submarine sailors battling to survive beneath continuous barrages set the stage for the next step in the combat at sea. If the human voices disclosed the cost of this battle, the machines themselves would soon indicate its direction. Technology, refined by necessity, tilted the balance in the Allied favor. Destroyer escorts, the smaller cousins of fleet destroyers, became the workhorses of the Atlantic and Pacific. Compact, swift, and bristling with specialist technology, these vehicles were designed to outmatch submarines that had once prowled the oceans with impunity. They carried radar that pierced the darkness and fog, sonar that reached into the depths, and Hedgehog projectors that threw patterns of lethal explosives ahead of the ship's bow. No longer did escorts wait to dump depth charges behind them. They could now fire weapons directly into a submarine's path. By 1944, these gains were proving decisive. One of the clearest displays happened in May of that year, when USS Buckley, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, fought the German submarine U-66 in the Atlantic. U-66 was no ordinary target. It was a veteran of countless patrols, one of the most experienced U-boats still operating against Allied ships. For the men of Buckley, meeting such a foe would test not just their training but the very systems designed to terminate the U-boat menace. The combat began in the pre-dawn hours of May 6th. Radar first detected the U-boat at range. Rather of depending on assumption or chance sightings, Buckley's crew could track the submarine's position with precision. Closing the distance, they prepared their firearms. The sonar operators detected encounters beneath the waves, but U-66, sensing danger, surfaced to fight. Submarine commanders often preferred to fight their assailants on the surface, where their deck guns could still do damage. But against a cruiser built for close combat, it was a risky bet. As Buckley raced ahead, the two warships engaged a fierce and unique contest. Machine guns boomed, tracer shots slashed across the waves, and the Hedgehog projectors fired their deadly pattern. The confrontation increased when Buckley rammed U-66, slamming the submarine with a shudder that raced through both hulls. For moments that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two opponents were locked together, steel grinding against steel, sailors firing at point-blank range. The men of Buckley fought with ferocity, their rifles spraying fire into the submarine. U-66, damaged and overwhelmed, could not escape. Flames, smoke, and the echo of explosions filled the scene until eventually the German crew abandoned ship. U-66 fell beneath the seas, completing its long career of pursuing Allied convoys. The victory belonged not just to the crew of Buckley, but to the revolutionary concept of escort warfare that technology had made feasible. This engagement carried relevance far beyond a single combat. For years, U-boats had trailed convoys across the Atlantic, threatening Britain's lifeline and delaying the Allied buildup. By mid-1943, radar-equipped planes and escort carriers had begun to cut heavily into submarine losses, but the introduction of destroyer escorts armed with sonar and Hedgehogs clinched the advantage. These ships could be manufactured in quantities the Axis could not hope to match. Where formerly convoys feared traveling unprotected, now they traveled under the guard of vessels geared to strike first and strike effectively. For German submariners, the effect was terrifying. Accounts from survivors described the impression of being chased not simply from above but from every direction. Radar stripped away the veil of night. Sonar denied the ocean's depths. Hedgehogs poured explosives onto their precise route. The combat beneath the seas, formerly distinguished by surprise attacks and stunning successes, was becoming a struggle merely to exist. The triumph of USS Buckley was also emblematic of the greater shift of naval warfare. No longer was victory based entirely on daring or fortuitous meetings. It was increasingly a matter of applied science, of engineers and shipbuilders turning laboratories into weapons that revolutionized the battlefield. The Allies had harnessed economic might to construct devices that gave their sailors an edge that could not be reversed. Still, the threat had not disappeared. U-boats continued to strike, and the Pacific conflict would offer its own dangers. Japanese submarines, however fewer in number than their German counterparts, tried to disrupt supply lines and inflict losses in contested waters. Yet the tactics that succeeded in the Atlantic were soon implemented across the globe. Escort groups, coordinated with aircraft and carriers, closed the net around enemy submarines wherever they traveled. By 1944, the momentum was evident. Where once convoys lost dozens of ships in a single month, today the balance tilted. Each encounter, like the destruction of U-66, proved that the Allies were not only controlling the waters but steadily reducing the submarine threat. The cost remained great, and perils still lurked beneath the seas, but the tide had changed in favor of those who commanded the technology of the period. The story of Buckley and U-66 was not simply about one ship and one submarine. It was the personification of how creativity, mass manufacturing, and persistent adaptability transformed the struggle for the oceans. The weapons deployed on destroyer escorts were not flawless, but they operated well enough, and in numbers great enough to overwhelm the undersea menace. As the Atlantic got more safe, Allied officials moved their eyes toward the Pacific, where another clash awaited. Submarines still prowled there, and new battles would test the endurance of sailors and the reach of technology once again. The voices of the prior chapters echo here. Submariners recounting the horror of persistent strikes, escorts exhibiting the edge of radar and hedgehogs. Now the stage was prepared for the Pacific theater to showcase its own chapters in the war beneath the waves. Following the intense technological struggles in the Atlantic, the lessons learnt there were now being transferred across the Pacific. Escort warships, their crews seasoned by months of hunting submarines and defending convoys, carried forth the experience and technologies that had begun to tilt the waters in America's favor. The terrible sacrifices of earlier convoys, the nervous vigil, and the scary depth-charge barrages all contributed to a turning point. The Pacific supply lines were now protected as never before. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of destroyer escorts, enhanced sonar, radar, and coordinated air assistance had changed the strategic landscape. Merchant convoys, formerly easy prey for Japanese submarines, now sailed under continual observation. Everts, Buckley, and Cannon-class escorts, bolstered by freshly commissioned John C. Butler-class ships, established layered defenses that combined speed, firepower, and sensor technology. Each escort carried sonar capable of detecting undersea threats, radar to overcome the darkness and weather, and Hedgehog projectors to attack before a submarine could retaliate. In this climate, Japanese submarine captains could no longer rely on stealth or surprise. Critical campaigns relied upon this increased security. Supplies, reinforcements, and munitions for operations at Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima reached their objectives with significantly better regularity than in the early years of the war. Troops arriving on unfriendly shores carried the confidence that their supply lines were not precarious, but actively defended by a navy prepared to dominate the undersea danger. Reports from ship captains and convoy commanders frequently indicated that battles with enemy submarines were increasingly one-sided. The hunter had become the hunted. The decline of Japanese submarine strength was clear and unequivocal. In late 1944, more than 120 submarines were lost in desperate operations across the Pacific, many falling victim to organized escort groups. For the Japanese Navy, the losses signified not just the destruction of vessels but also the degradation of experienced crews, trained during years of conflict. A submarine without an expert crew was as vulnerable as any other target, and replacements were growing scarce. Allied intelligence, combining intercepted communications and reconnaissance data, confirmed that the strategic initiative had transferred decisively to the United States Navy. The escort's responsibility extended beyond simply protection. They served as the backbone of operational planning, enabling task forces to operate with a sense of security in previously contested waters. Convoy operations were no longer just supply movements but important elements of bigger amphibious and offensive strategy. Without these strong lifelines, campaigns at Saipan and Leyte could have faltered, and the hard-won momentum in the Central and Western Pacific might have stagnated. Instead, the success of these operations emphasized the importance of industrial output, technological innovation, and tactical cooperation that defined the U.S. Navy in 1944. Human experience aboard these ships remained intense, even as losses reduced. Sailors faced lengthy hours of watch, scanning radar displays and sonar plots, braced for startling signals. Each signal pinged by sonar or radar might make the difference between safe passage and disastrous attack. Yet morale was lifted by actual results. Encounters increasingly concluded with the submarine neutralized, the convoy proceeding undamaged. The psychological transformation was substantial. Dread and uncertainty were progressively replaced with trust in the procedures and training that had been painstakingly created over the preceding years. Japanese submariners, encountering this technological and tactical progress, faced uncertainty and frustration. Survivors recalled that depth charge patterns suddenly seemed omnipresent. Radar-guided gunfire closed off escape routes, and Hedgehog mortars struck with unpredictable speed. The stealth that had long distinguished submarine warfare was vanishing under the unrelenting pace of invention. For commanders like those on U-66 and other Atlantic counterparts, the lessons were clear. Contemporary escorts, constructed in numbers and armed with superior detection systems, could no longer be underestimated. The broader strategic implication of these protected convoys was the continuing flow of men and material to crucial places across the Pacific. With Saipan and Leyte receiving timely reinforcements, the ground was prepared for the Philippines campaign, which in turn helped the liberation of additional islands closer to Japan. At Iwo Jima, the capacity to sustain forces with consistent supplies allowed Marines and soldiers to conduct actions that would otherwise have been compromised by shortages of ammunition, medical equipment, and provisions. The integration of safe supply into combat preparation underscored a fundamental that would continue to characterize Allied success. Control of the sea routes meant control of the operational tempo. In addition to tactical advantages, the destruction of Japanese submarines in late 1944 signified a strategic collapse. Japan's surviving vessels were focused, aiming to disrupt convoys in more dangerous operations. Yet these frantic maneuvers sometimes led to further losses, exacerbating the degradation of submarine capabilities. By the end of the year, the balance of naval strength in the Pacific had altered significantly. Allied commanders could plan operations with an expectation of supply security that had been unachievable just 2 years ago. This makeover was the culmination of years of gradual progress. Early escorts, deployed when fleets were stretched thin, had proved the requirement of specialized anti-submarine ships. Their technology evolved swiftly, incorporating sonar, radar, and Hedgehog systems to generate a force multiplier effect. Training initiatives refined crew responses, ensuring that detection led immediately to involvement. Each convoy's successful passage validated the concept that drove destroyer escort development and deployment. As supply lines steadied, the U.S. Navy could focus on the next stage of operations, projecting power closer to Japan itself. The lessons of 1944 would shape preparation for 1945, where every landing, from Okinawa to the Japanese home islands, would rely on the smooth delivery of men and materials. Convoys, previously insecure and risky, had become secure arteries sustaining the drive toward triumph. The lessons of the Pacific, embodied in these escorted convoys, underlined the interaction of technology, industrial capability, and operational discipline. Submarines that had once threatened to sever lifelines were neutralized via design, coordination, and constant adaptability. The narrative of the seas, from the early dark days of unprotected commerce to the secure movement of crucial resources, was a testament to strategic forethought and technological edge. With the stage prepared, the remaining stages of the Pacific campaign would unfold, guided by the solid lifelines that escorts ensured. The next phase would bring battles with lingering pockets of resistance, but the balance had tipped. Allied domination of the sea lanes allowed for continuous pressure, suggesting the coming end of Japan's capacity to wage an effective naval campaign. The final chapter starts up where the last left off, charting the culmination of years of struggle and ingenuity at sea. By 1945, the Pacific Ocean bore witness to the remarkable shift of naval warfare, as the persistent efforts of American shipbuilders, tacticians, and sailors united to secure the lifelines that had delivered victory across thousands of miles. The once feared Japanese submarine fleet, which had wreaked havoc on commerce convoys and threatened to destroy supply lines, had been ruthlessly neutralized. What remained was a shadow of its former might, a tribute to the strategic and technological progress that the U.S. Navy had accomplished over the course of the war. This metamorphosis did not occur overnight. From the initial, fragile convoys of 1942 to the advanced, heavily armed escort groups of 1944 and 1945, the tale of destroyer escorts demonstrates the American willingness to learn, adapt, and apply lessons under fire. Ships like USS England D-635, famed for her historic anti-submarine exploits, had become emblematic of this new era. The vessel's combination of sonar, radar, and Hedgehog projectors highlighted the cutting-edge fusion of technology and tactics. Crews trained to identify, track, and destroy submarines with accuracy have shifted the balance of power on the open seas. In military terms, these escorts were more than just weapons platforms, they were guards of supply routes. The Pacific Wars depended on the steady flow of troops, equipment, fuel, and provisions. Each convoy represented not only a logistical requirement but the lifeblood of strategy, guaranteeing that the soldiers landing on Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and beyond could continue operations without interruption. Where formerly supply ships had been easy prey, they now sailed inside protected screens of alert escorts, their advance sheltered by a network of sensors and weapons that predicted and killed the undersea threat before it could strike. The tactical evolution of destroyer escorts changed the Japanese reaction. By 1945, submarine commanders faced insurmountable odds. Reports from the last months of the battle show troops contending with continuous sonar detection, radar-guided gunfire, and the brutal accuracy of Hedgehog attacks. The psychological toll on these guys was considerable. The ability to strike unseen had disappeared, leaving few options for effective engagement. For the U.S. Navy, the consequence was decisive. The attrition of enemy submarines diminished both their numbers and the expertise of their sailors, ensuring that every subsequent engagement further cemented American superiority at sea. USS England's record serves as a symbol of this greater narrative. Her 12-day operation against Japanese submarines in May 1944 had already predicted the final collapse of the enemy undersea force. By 1945, the lessons demonstrated by England and her sister ships had been institutionalized into doctrine. Convoy protection was no longer a reactive measure but a proactive strategy, blending intelligence, training, and technical innovation to avert losses before they could occur. The resultant operational confidence permitted the United States to conduct amphibious operations deep within hostile waters with a reliability that had been inconceivable just 3 years previous. The human dimension of the escort conflict cannot be underestimated. Sailors faced extended watches in often harsh conditions, entrusted with keeping continual attention. Yet they did it with an increasing sense of purpose and pride. Each successful convoy clearance confirmed their training and highlighted the necessity of their task. For many, the task was dull, yet the prospect of a submarine attack made every hour essential. The combination of regularity and possible risk established the character of the escort sailor resilient, disciplined, and increasingly confident in the capabilities of their warships and systems. Strategically, the collapse of Japanese submarine operations in the Pacific had far-reaching ramifications. Supply routes to frontline locations remained intact, enabling prolonged offensives that spanned throughout the enormous ocean theater. The security offered by destroyer escorts directly helped to the success of campaigns that moved Allied forces closer to Japan, affecting the operating tempo and ultimately determining the timing of significant landings. The need of maintaining secure sea lanes became a core pillar of naval doctrine, emphasizing the essential junction of technology, industrial output, and tactical execution. The industrial dimension of the escort conflict also demands emphasis. The quick production of specialized destroyer escorts, together with their associated weapon systems and sensor equipment, represented the amazing output of American shipyards and the creativity of naval architects. Classes such as Everts, Buckley, Cannon, and John C. Butler demonstrated not only technological development but also production efficiency, allowing the U.S. Navy to field sufficient numbers to ensure continuous convoy protection across numerous theaters. Each vessel held the imprint of an industrial and logistical machine functioning at unprecedented scale, indicating how national capability translated directly into operational success. As the Pacific theater reached its conclusion, the significance of these escorts stretched beyond immediate tactical victory. The ships and their sailors had built a model of maritime domination based on adaptation, innovation, and tireless pursuit of strategic objectives. The principles developed, integrating technology, training, and operational planning, would affect naval thinking for decades to come. They demonstrated that dominance of the sea requires not only weapons but also vision, preparedness, and the ability to learn from experience under the hardest conditions. The escort battle also changed conceptions of naval might. Destroyer escorts, formerly considered inferior to bigger capital ships, developed as vital weapons of strategic impact. Their capacity to defend convoys, discourage enemy submarines, and permit persistent offensive operations demonstrated that smaller, specialized warships might have a disproportionate impact on the course of a global struggle. In this sense, the legacy of the escort war is as much about innovation in naval doctrine as it is about wins in specific encounters. By the end of 1945, the Pacific Ocean had been secured, and Japan's submarine threat had been neutralized. The ships that had preserved this victory, Everts, Buckley, Cannon, John C. Butler, and the famed USS England, stood as enduring icons of American commitment, industrial strength, and tactical innovation. Their contribution guaranteed that the United States could project power across great distances, defend crucial lifelines, and finally bring the war to a triumphant finish. The narrative of destroyer escorts finishes not only with statistics or war records but with the greater lesson that adaptation, technology, and unflinching dedication could transform vulnerability into strength. The soldiers who served aboard these boats carried forward a legacy that went well beyond 1945, influencing future generations of naval strategy and exemplifying the ideals of sea power that remain pertinent to this day. With the Pacific supply line safe and the submarine menace neutralized, the curtain closed on a key chapter of naval history. The escort battle at sea had concluded, leaving behind a legacy of invention, courage, and the concrete display of how industry and human endeavor united to accomplish final triumph.